refreshing to see if it started.
Okay. Says we're okay. Yeah, looks like we're live. So first off, of course, I know nobody's in here yet because obviously we just started. But for people who are watching this later, first and foremost, happy Easter, everybody. Kind of sucks that we've got social distancing Easter, but at least it makes it less of a problem for me to be here and maintaining consistency of this weekly live streaming. So I don't really have much much to say that hasn't been said already about the county's status on the virus, except for, I guess, one cool important thing is this Altogether Los Alamos, which is a volunteer organization that's been set up by several local people, including at least 3 county councilors, David Israelovitz, Randy Righty, and James Robinson. I know that Mara O'Neill of the Los Alamos Reporter is also involved. I've gotten some sense that other people are involved, like I think the county's emergency management person is part of it. So, this is certainly, backed by the right people in the county. The main thing that the organization is setting out to do is providing support to people who are at home and are not in as great a position to get out. So, it's including wellness calls just to make sure that people are still doing all right. Grocery delivery is one thing, or I guess delivery of stuff from around town, including apparently prescription drugs. So that's cool. Apparently, David said that he talked to Smiths about it, and it is possible for volunteers to pick up drugs for people. Hey, thanks for joining. So yeah, I know it's still early days on that, but it is now accepting requests for assistance as well as people who are interested in volunteering. So I know you can find that on the Los Alamos Reporter, and you can find it around Facebook. I think that David said that he's putting out another press release about it, or possibly that's already gone out. So yeah, if you either want to volunteer to help people in the community, or if you need help, keep your eyes peeled in the newspapers for more information about that. So I think that's the main thing that's happened, to my knowledge, in the last week as far as virus stuff goes. So somebody did send a question to me that I'll go ahead and address here, though who knows, maybe it'll come up again. So he says, the question I'd like to ask is, how can the county motivate, incentivize the empty property space, Smiths, etc., or charge huge taxes if commercial properties are left vacant for a long time? So I know that a lot of people have talked about, so people have talked about a vacancy tax, and I was told that that a vacancy tax is probably illegal. So I it was a counselor who told me that, so I assume that represents the position of the county attorney's office. It definitely wouldn't surprise me if vacancy tax is illegal. My sort of speculation about it from having gone to real estate school is that vacancy tax would be considered property tax, and property tax has to be proportional to the value of the property, right? So, every year you get that letter from the county assessor's office that has the new assessed value of your property. And basically, the way that property tax works is, the county computes or sets the budget for the year, and they take their other income sources. For us, actually, an awful lot of that is that we get gross receipts tax from the lab, but they take out all the other revenue sources, that permanent fund, which is investments the county's made, stuff like that, and whatever's left over, they take that amount and they divide it by the total assessed value of all the property in the county, and they charge each property owner a fraction, the appropriate fraction of that. So the Latin term is ad valorem, which means at value. So the issue is that property tax, as I understand it, has to be at value as a matter of state law. So as a result, the argument goes that a vacancy tax would represent an illegal property tax. It would be a property tax that is imposed not at the value of the property. So with that in mind, there are still plenty of things that we can do downtown, things that are legal. So the two main things that I'm aware of, the two main things I'd like to see in terms of downtown vacancy, just the general state of downtown, is really twofold. So first off, so there's this interesting dynamic in Los Alamos, which is ordinarily, if you have a crummy downtown, property values reflect that fact. So it's, well, among other things, property owners are generally motivated to extract more value from their property, and so property owners will generally welcome revitalization efforts. Here, that's just not true, and I think one of the biggest reasons for it is that while having a nice downtown matters to business, it doesn't really matter very much to offices. An office is a place that you go to suffer for 8 hours a day, and people who are suffering in their office, just generally don't care as much about how it looks. It's just a job, right? So I do think that the presence of the lab downtown is actually a big factor behind how bad downtown is. So that carries with it myriad other problems. And one of the biggest problems is that, the lab has nearly limitless money at its disposal. So while the lab can, per DOE policy, only rent space at appraised value, appraisals can ratchet up over time. Since an appraisal is really just a sort of averaging of rents that are currently being paid, but with some wiggle room on them. If you simply charge the highest rent that's supported by appraisal, that will tend to increase the highest rent supported by appraisal as each new lease gets factored into the next appraisal that's done. So as a result, it's absolutely possible to ratchet up appraisals. So that's a very sort of long and roundabout way of saying that I think one of the biggest things that we could do for downtown is ban first floor offices by zoning code. Make it so that retail spaces have to be devoted to retail space. And among other things, that should have the effect of pushing rents down because, there will no longer be the federal upward pressure on rents. The other thing as you know, because so much of the downtown is office, and it just sort of creates the expectation of downtown looking like an office park. Um, so I think that what people are complaining about, or upset about, um, more than vacancy, is just decay. Um, but the sort of interesting fact about that is the county can actually just legally require commercial property to look good. That's the development code, chapter 16. So the development code generally is concerned with things like how close a building can be to the street, right? Setbacks, that's called, or lot coverage, right? How much of a property can be taken up by buildings. Um, but it also concerns not just parking spaces, but also landscaping requirements. So the county does actually require that a certain amount of property be devoted to landscaping, or at least to sort of things other than buildings and parking spaces, right? So all that's already part of the development code, but the development code also actually does include aesthetic requirements for buildings, and you can already see this in the new buildings, right? The new buildings in the county actually do have a bit of a uniform look to them, and by that I mean sort of the new Smiths and what they call the pad sites, the buildings that are in that parking lot with like Domino's, there's a salon, a dentist, a Verizon franchise. So the O'Reilly building is new. It has this similar kind of modern desert look to it. Right. So these things are already part of code. It's just that only new buildings actually get held to them. But one power the county actually does have at its disposal is the ability to impose these requirements on existing commercial property. And then the caveat with that is that they have to be phased in. Right? So, one big action the county can take is to say, well, your buildings need to look like new Smiths, like the O'Reilly building, and you have 5 years to get it done. And if you don't, then you're not in compliance and we can start fining you. So this is sort of an interesting thing overall, right? So people talk about vacancy tax as a way of, I think, trying to like sort of force property owners to get tenants in there in order to have that spur better aesthetics downtown. But ultimately, the legally more defensible thing is actually to just cut out the middleman on that and just say, well, what we really want is for downtown to look good. And so that's just the requirement, make downtown look good. So that's at least where I am on all of that. I'm certainly always interested in other suggestions, but those are the main legal avenues that I know to be open to us. And I do think that, on the one hand, the concern with saying, property owners, you have to renovate your property because it looks like an office park from the 60s. I know that the immediate reaction people tend to have to that is, well, property owners will just pass the costs on to tenants. And that's why I'm always very careful to present both angles of this simultaneously. Right? We need the office ban to remove the federal government from the at least retail or sort of more traditional commercial rental market in order to counteract that effect. Right? That if the lab is not available as a tenant anymore, or lab contractors, then there just isn't much space for landlords to pass renovation costs on to tenants. So I do think we need both, and I have increasingly been getting the sense that the idea of the first floor office ban does actually have a fair amount of support, and it is probably going to happen. But the development code aesthetic requirements on existing property, that hasn't really been talked about. And I think the main reason it hasn't really been talked about is that it's just not even well known to be an option. So that is one of the things that I want to do in this campaign, is to raise awareness of the options that are really at the county's disposal. So that was the question that I had received within the last week. So at this point, I suppose I will ask John whether or not he has anything.
Yeah, so recently you answered some questions for the League of Women Voters. Do you want to go into more detail over those? I do have the questions on hand if you want to do that, or do you want to save that potentially for later?
No, so that's a fair point. So yeah, John brought up that the League of Women Voters contacted us recently because they are compiling their voter guide for the primary. So they posed 3 questions to all of the candidates for council, or I guess at least the Democratic candidates, because we're the only ones holding a primary for this race. So the questions were, what do you consider to be the biggest issues facing the county, and what do you want to do about them? The second was, should the county be greener, right, more carbon neutral? And the third was, what do you think about housing and transportation, particularly with the lab growing? So yeah, it is probably worth talking about those. So since I'm coming at council from a business perspective, I consider the business issues at least the most important to me. So the sort of the things that I had just talked about, the sort of property regulation stuff, I consider that at least my sort of key issues in this election. Regarding the second one, so the county and carbon neutrality. Now, obviously, one of the biggest problems that the county has is that it's landlocked. So a lot of infrastructure projects that one might want, such as renewable energy, as it stands, we just don't have the space to pursue a lot of that. Now, there is kind of an interesting side point in this, which is Technical Area 21. So TA 21 is where DP Road ends. It was, I believe, an old uranium processing site from the 40s. So it's dirty. And that is why it's one of the few technical areas that's really sort of in town. And it's fenced off, and there's a gate and all of that. And cleanup continues. I believe that that's one of the reasons that N3B has come in, though I'm not certain on that. Actually, I don't really know a whole lot about what N3B does. But so cleanup of TA21 has been going on for a long time. And maybe someday TA21 will actually be released. DOE has been trying to release land like this to the county. Now, the issue there is that it's probably just never going to get cleaned to the point where you would want to put housing there, or even industry. So one sort of interesting question about the county and renewable infrastructure is, if the TA21 cleanup ever does happen, that might actually represent a pretty big amount of space that's just not usable for much other than something like solar cells or something like that. So that's at least this kind of interesting future possibility. But as is in terms of the county and carbon neutrality, as I said, space is an issue, much more so than money. So one thing that, or I guess there's 2 things that have been going around. One of them is municipal food composting. So this has so far been talked about as a commercial operation. So the problem with, I guess, composting with a lot of sort of infrastructure behind it is that you really need the food to be loose. Um, even though there are things that claim to be compostable bags, that's already kind of a lie. But as is, the bags will gum up the machinery. So as a result, the challenge with municipal food composting is really needing bins filled with loose food, uh, and that's kind of a logistical nightmare on the residential front. And I'm not sure whether or not a great solution ever really will be forthcoming. Um, but on the other hand, it is something that can be done with commercial customers, primarily restaurants and grocery stores. Right? So, the sort of overhead and headache of dealing with bins full of loose food, that is a burden that businesses can take on. And so I think that's very much worth pursuing. And I think at the very least we should be doing a pilot program for commercial food composting. Just dropping a couple $100,000 to buy some big machines to make it happen. On the residential side, the main things to do, and I think this is kind of public works position as well, is that residential food composting is probably just going to have to stay at home. So the county can become a supplier of composting bins, but more importantly, the county can become educators on how to do food composting. So that's probably where food composting is headed, and that all seems very reasonable to me. There was another thing that went around lately where I do have to disagree with what the council has decided to do, and that's plastic bags. So I don't think that there's much of a business problem with a blanket ban on plastic bags, and the reason is pretty simple. So if you ban plastic bags, it does become more expensive to do businesses that use plastic bags. So to be fair, Automotive Professionals is not one of them. But ultimately, when you run a business and you're thinking about things like how much markup am I going to charge on this, right? The markup has to include all the costs of doing business, right? So it has to include the wages that you pay to employees. It has to cover your rent. It has to cover your maintenance. So that's all where markup goes. So if plastic bags are banned across the board, then yeah, things will get a bit more expensive in the county, but it doesn't represent a competitive advantage, not really, because those costs are going to be borne by everybody. That's why a blanket ban makes more sense than nearly any other policy on getting rid of plastic bags. So the county, there was a petition to have the county ban plastic bags, and council ultimately decided not to do it. And I do basically disagree with council on that. The other thing that can be done is, since the county has much more money than space, owing to particularly the gross receipts tax that we charge to the lab, the county can do renewable energy investment in other counties. Something of basically having another county or using a middleman to do this, but ultimately putting renewable energy infrastructure somewhere else. And then, reaping the renewable energy, and then, paying some costs for the county that's hosting the infrastructure. That's certainly something that the county can do, and I believe is doing. So, I think that carbon neutrality is definitely something that we should be heading towards. We basically just have to sort of use the fact that we have money and not space. So then the third question was about housing and transportation in the county. So, of course, there we have the similar problems that where we don't have a lot of space. So in the shorter term, the county and school board have been working to make their lands available for housing, and I definitely support these measures in general, right? So I think that putting housing on North Mesa, I think it's a good idea. Um, I think ultimately the main question there is just what form it'll take, and how it'll impact traffic and all of that. And I know that before any 30-acre development could happen on North Mesa, there'll have to be traffic impact studies. But I think that's good. There's DP Road, so apparently these things aren't actually very well known, and I guess I know virtually everything there is to know about DP Road. So this is another sort of interesting situation. So there's two parcels that have been transferred to the private sector. One on the north side of DP Road, which is slated to be income qualified apartments, and one on the south side that was slated to be elderly housing. So there's an interesting question there now, because so the county had hired a contractor, Parker Construction, to come out and do trenching to put in a sewer line. Right. So one of the other fascinating facts about DP Road is that it doesn't have sewer service at the moment. Automotive Professionals is on sewer because we're close enough to Trinity, but by and large, DP Road is on septic. So they were doing some sewer infrastructure upgrades for the income qualified housing, and when they were out there backhoeing, they dug up some Manhattan Project refuse, which included small amounts of plutonium and a lead crucible. So what this means for DP Road is currently unclear. On the one hand, there's what's the DOE going to do about this, right? So the DOE transferred the land to the county, but that included a deed restriction that if stuff like this happens, that the federal government is still on the hook for it. So this is DOE's problem. It's not the county's problem. But, will housing development on DP Road be allowed to go forward with this discovery? That's really unclear at the moment. I think that the income qualified apartments are still in the clear, but the plutonium and the lead was discovered right next to where the elderly housing was supposed to go in. So that project is in limbo. And because lead is, of course, like the number one hazardous material when it comes to residential, and finding lead underground, part of DP Road is now a hazardous materials site. So the State Environment Department is presumably going to get involved. And worse, the plutonium and lead was discovered just over the eastern property line for the elderly housing. And, it's another bit of sort of real estate knowledge. There is housing and urban development rules about putting, people who are worse off in some fashion on undesirable land. So saying, hey, elderly people come move to this hazardous materials site, right? That's not really that's not a good sell, and it's also probably illegal. So now that also brings up the other DP Road parcel. So there's 22 acres of county land, which is so the parcel. I mean, it's huge and it's kind of L-shaped. It goes out onto a different mesa quite a ways. and it fronts onto DP Road between where we are and where the elderly housing is set to go in. So, there is also the question, right? So the county, at least prior to the discovery of the plutonium, the county had been trying to spin up a development project there. What the plutonium and lead mean for that is also uncertain at the moment. But that's at least sort of that stuff. Now, on the other hand, part of why I care so much about spurring redevelopment of downtown is the fact that downtown Los Alamos has a mixed use zoning right now. So downtown could be another place to put housing in. We could and should, and I think the county wants this, that we start living the mixed use dream of having buildings that are, retail on the first floor and residential on higher floors. So I think the county wants that, but the problem is, how do you get it? And I think that one of the big reasons that we don't have it is because there's so much deferred maintenance downtown. It's simply too expensive to do that kind of redevelopment. So I think in terms of downtown housing, that's really the problem that we need to tackle. So my proposals for spurring downtown redevelopment should actually end up being a housing push as well. As far as transportation goes, we definitely have, again, some sort of intergovernmental problems. I think most people are aware of the fact that Trinity Drive is actually the continuation of a state highway. So it's a state road, and that's why, the county, aggressively plowed in the winter and potholed Diamond and Trinity. And so we've had Diamond completely repaved, and that's wonderful. And Trinity is still treacherous. And that's ultimately the county can't do or can't act alone on that one. So that always does present a transportation problem, but I think that the most pressing transportation problem we have is really the access to White Rock. So the truck route and State Road 4 intersect at a traffic light, and there's not very many lanes at that traffic light. So, whenever I need to go to White Rock at, in the late afternoon, traffic is heinous, and it's sort of weird for us to be the small community with these little traffic jams. So the expansion of that intersection is probably the most immediate transportation concern that we have. In terms of North Mesa, as I said, if the school board does actually get to the point of doing development of some kind there, the county is going to require a transportation study. And so we'll ultimately be looking at whoever does the study for recommendations on what to do about, the roundabout down there on Diamond and San Ildefonso and North Mesa Road. Now, I do also know that if we start doing more downtown redevelopment, we may actually come to the point of parking being a problem. So this is something that the Community Development Department of the county government bemoans occasionally, and I know that several county councilors do as well, particularly Antonio Majori, is the issue of just how much of downtown is devoted to parking. And right now, that has a lot to do with just the so right now that just has a lot to do with the code, right, with the parking requirements that are imposed. Our current lead planner likes to say that we have the parking requirements of like a suburb, and so I do agree with that, right? We should loosen the parking requirements downtown to allow more of downtown to be developed. But then the caveat that comes up with that is there need to be parking spaces somewhere. So I'd like to see us being proactive about the good possibility of hitting a serious parking crunch downtown, and just have the county put up a structure, right? So I know that this has been talked about in various ways, but it's never really gotten off the ground. But I think that one or more structures in downtown Los Alamos is really going to be kind of necessary in the medium term. Uh, as for White Rock, I guess we'll have to see how successful redevelopment efforts down there can be. Um,
So Susan had a question. Did you address this? Why not ban plastic bags and charge for paper bags for those who don't want to bother with reusable bags? Or did you address that?
well, so the county, I don't know. So the county can tax bags if it wants to. And that taxes would go into the general fund. Um, and yeah, it's certainly possible that just the way that businesses would handle it is charging for paper bags to offset their costs rather than bundling their costs into their general markup. Um, whether or not the county should charge for paper bags or charge for plastic bags, those are certainly fine other suggestions as well. I guess I don't personally feel as strongly about paper bags as I do about plastic for the sort of obvious reasons, right? Plastic, plastic clogs up landfills. Plastic never breaks down. So, yeah, well, paper certainly has its own problems. Obviously, deforestation or just cutting down a bunch of trees is a problem. At the very least, it's not sort of creating this long-term problem for the ecosystem that plastic does. So I guess a tax on paper bags. I think I would support that. I guess I don't feel that that's as important as banning plastic bags from an environmental perspective. There's always the question of, I guess, how much stuff you want to bring into the scope of any sort of legislative agenda. Certainly, I wouldn't want a tax on paper bags to get in the way of banning plastic bags. I believe there's also an issue that since this would be a tax, I believe would have to go to referendum. So the county council can ban plastic bags on its own, but the county council cannot impose taxes on its own. So that's the other thing, right? They are certainly separate issues. Yeah, and Charlotte here brought up that the absentee voting again. Yeah, so this is a really important thing, and John put into the chat nmvote.org, which is just a redirect to the Secretary of State's voting information page, allows you to apply for an absentee ballot. And I believe that the state has gone to a sort of no cause absentee ballot. Like you don't have to give a reason that you want an absentee ballot because the reason is obvious. So yeah, I definitely encourage everybody to go to nmvote.org and apply for an absentee ballot. And yeah, as John also pointed out in chat, primary voting day is June 2nd. The general is in November, the 3rd, I believe. And that is going to be a big election, right? So our general election is going to include, U.S. president, obviously. We have a U.S. House seat opening up. And I believe U.S. Senate as well. Let's see. Related to the bags and shopping question, does everybody feel their current shopping ratio for local to online is more or less or the same? It's always the question if shopping has been dialed back in general because of physical distancing. Yeah, and certainly for the next few months, this is going to be, a problem for the business community. our restaurants, several of our restaurants have gone to carry out and delivery, but uh, basically places other than auto shops, auto supply stores, and restaurants and grocery stores are shut down. So, yeah, I suspect there we're going to have the interesting conundrum that Amazon has gotten a lot slower at delivering, obviously, combined with a bunch of business closures. Though obviously that carries with it the point you always have to say, support our local restaurants through these times. Do carry out and take out. I think most of them are still open.
Let's see here. Uh, just a random question you may not notice. Do you know if any of our local cases are utilizing the Los Alamos Medical Center, or if anybody has been admitted? Probably don't.
I think I'd heard, although I'm not certain. I think I'd heard that people were staying home. Oh, yeah, grocery shopping is still local, but I find myself going to Santa Fe because they have more supplies. Yeah, I know. Jordan and I went grocery shopping today, and you kind of can't go to the grocery store. Um, yeah, you kind of can't go to the grocery store with a list because you don't even know what you'll find. Well, and yeah, of course, the reason to get an absentee ballot. Yeah. Um, well, I don't actually know if the polls are going to be physically open, and I'm sure it'll be possible to vote in person and to do so safely. There's protocols that have been developed. Wearing masks, staying far away from people, being diligent about washing your hands. I imagine that in-person voting will still be possible. But the big reason to get an absentee ballot is just that even if in-person voting is still being held, it's going to be a lot slower, because of all of the protocols. So, you could end up in a line to vote, which would be kind of an unusual thing for this county. But as for cases of the coronavirus, so one of the things that had come up at one of the discussions that was a bit worrisome was when we were told that there had been no cases in the county, there had also only been 40 odd tests done at that time for a county of 18 to 19,000. So, whether or not no cases was really believable was in question. Now there are 2 reported cases, I believe, last I checked. But also, last weekend, the State Department of Health did a testing site at Overlook Park in White Rock. I think they did, if I remember right, somewhere around 150 tests. The big thing there was because there's still a shortage of testing supplies, the testing criteria were pretty strict. It was people who have symptoms, people who live with someone who has symptoms, or people who work four cases, yeah. Or people who work at congregant facilities, so like group homes and nursing homes. So I had considered getting tested, but I didn't actually fall into the criteria, right? I have no symptoms. I don't know anybody with symptoms. So on the other hand, it does mean that, we'll have like more than tripled the number of tests done. So that'll be good. I mean, it'll be good once the results are out, or At least I hadn't heard the results if they have been released, or maybe that's where the 4 number comes from. To get a better picture for the real number of infections in the county.
Completely different question that I have
Mm.
here. Related to tourism, I don't think we've talked about this before, is a lot of our, maybe we have, but a lot of our events are mostly like single day sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine any sort of multi-day events or changing our current events to multi-day that might attract overnight tourists?
Right. So, yeah. So the tourism question. So there's sort of this interesting thing that happens with events in the county, and I guess with the county in general, there always seems to be this desire to leverage World War II and science as the reasons to come here versus really just the fact that it's an incredibly beautiful place. So, you know, the sort of unusual event series we have obviously is the summer concert series. And as the summer concert series occasionally attracts well-known acts, it attracts at least people from around northern New Mexico. But you know, if tourism is going to be a major part, yeah. So yeah, if tourism is going to be a part of the economy, then we probably need a wider reach than that. So, you know, as is, the county again did a wonderful job with the Ashley Pond redevelopment, and you know, put in an actual stage there. So one, one thing that that John brings up is that he and his wife really like the Bluegrass Festival in Durango, Colorado, which is a multi-day, multi-venue, you know, wear a wristband to indicate that you've paid, and just sort of wander around town, seeing various bluegrass acts. And, you know, so my feeling on tourism in general is that tourism is really not a good idea at the moment, because the worst possible thing that could happen is tourists coming to Los Alamos and experiencing our downtown and then going home and complaining about it to everybody that they know. And that would be a reputation that would be hard to shake off. So, my general feeling about tourism is that downtown rehabilitation is really sort of a prerequisite to tourism being a good idea. But if we do get to the point of actually having a nice downtown, then I think his point about the Bluegrass Festival in Durango is really well taken, which is that you know, we should also then start looking at multi-day, multi-venue, uh, you know, tourist events to actually keep people in the county, you know, for days, rather than just having this sort of occasional injection of food truck traffic that we get with the concert series. So, yeah. Any shout outs anyone wants to give to local businesses that are helping to accommodate distancing? Any favorites that you want to give a thumbs up to? So I certainly have to commend Marcel Remelieu for how quickly he's gotten his stuff together, you know, to shifting flirtily to online ordering, and Marcel himself actually driving around town, delivering delivering crepes to people's houses. You know, we've certainly gotten delivery from them. And then, yeah, I know that, you know, most restaurants don't really let you mill about very long. I actually have been to several restaurants doing carry out for the shop. You know, so I know that, I know Rigoberto's is still open and doing carry out. And of course, Cafe Sushi, which is my favorite restaurant in town, uh, is doing carry out.
Easter dinner from the golf course, so they're bringing that to us
Oh,
at 5:15.
so is the golf course, are they doing delivery, or you?
Yeah, after a certain amount, I think it's $20. They're doing free delivery, and so we're getting our Easter dinner from the golf course tonight.
Okay. Yeah. So the golf course is apparently doing delivery for more expensive orders. Yeah, I see phases of developing downtown as a viable option. Um, yeah. So I suppose like in general, yeah, Cottonwood on the Greens. That's the restaurant at the golf course. Um, so yeah, in general, I do think that the private sector can do downtown redevelopment. I don't really think that this has to be a sort of a total county thing. Uh, yes, yes. Catherine says, shout out to mechanic shops not making customers come inside following safe protocols. Yeah, um, thanks for that. Yeah, so I think that with downtown, the sort of specific thing that I said to the League of Women Voters is that downtown is trapped in a feedback loop, and the loop is that disinvestment, not adequately maintaining things, uh, disinvestment makes it more expensive to do rehabilitation and redevelopment, and that leads to further disinvestment. So I really think that the main thing that the county needs to do downtown is just break the feedback loop on that. And I think if that happens, if we get out of this malaise of disinvestment, I think that the redevelopment absolutely can come from the private sector. I think there are, entrepreneurial types with access to credit who can make it happen. Uh, but first, we just need to like get out of the hump. So that would certainly be phased in a certain sense. If it's being driven by a bunch of individuals, they'll all be working on their own timelines, and we can definitely see different things happening at different paces. Um, but I guess I don't know. I'm not really much of a master planner myself in terms of these things.
So just, I guess, one comment to make since we're coming up on here on the end is recently Los Alamos got a shout out from our governor on good social distancing or physical distancing practices through the cell phone data. So, any thoughts of what more we could do? We seem to be model citizens for the governor, and I guess that's not too much of a surprise
Right.
since we're a town full of scientists and other highly educated professionals.
Yeah. So what you said was apparently that. So they've been they social scientists have been scoring counties on how good they are at social distancing based on cell phone location data, and we are one of the best in the state. Though there is a big caveat that has to go along with that, which is that this is a very rural state. So, someplace like Rio Arriba County, where there's just a lot of sort of properties out in the middle of nowhere, or like large properties where you have to drive 5 miles to get to the grocery store, is that poor social distancing. I don't think that the cell phone data will really tell you much, and likewise, if it's being done nationally, I'm not sure how tuned into the details of any particular county such modeling would be. So that is sort of the caveat about considering conclusions like that. That said, I don't know. People, um, yeah, I think that people in the county are, by and large, obeying the stay-at-home orders. Um, there is always some discussion about the sort of fact that on the one hand, um, the county is currently keeping the parks and trails open as a sort of release valve from staying at home all the time, and I think that's the right thing to do. It does unfortunately mean that if you are going out on the trails, you probably should be wearing a mask because you probably will run into other people. And the sort of 6 foot distance that's been suggested by what WHO and CDC, I know that's a tricky thing to really um, adhere to on a trail because most trails simply aren't that wide. So I guess mainly be conscientious if you're out on the trails. Parks are obviously easier to stay isolated. Keep in mind that the governor's rule is prohibiting groups of 6 or greater. So, don't congregate at the parks. I think everybody probably knows that, but it's always worth pointing out. I think that grocery store etiquette may be a bit of a work in progress, right? There's always sort of the problem with the grocery store that aisles are basically 2 carts wide, and you kind of can't avoid running into people. And honestly, having gone grocery shopping today, I'm not sure how to properly deal with this, how to keep adequate distance from people. Of course, Jordan and I were wearing masks at the shop. I don't know, probably half the people there were. The big caveat on masks is that they are not 100% effective. So, don't think that wearing a mask means that you can nuzzle up to people. But yeah, how we should all sort of collectively manage this, I don't know. I mean, at least one thing that pops into my mind that Smiths might want to consider is actually making the aisles one way so that, and then just like avoid passing people, right? Trying to actually keep 6 foot distance. I know that keeping a 6 foot distance in the grocery store just grinds your shopping to a halt. But on the other hand, that's still a lot better than dying.
Yeah, there's also new information that, which may update the rules, is that the CDC has a newer report out that believes that the minimum distance might be 13 feet. And
Okay.
so we might have to be changing to like 4 meter distance.
Yeah, so we might go to 4 meter separation. And yeah, if that's true, I know grocery shopping is going to be just unbelievably painful if we try and follow that, but we probably need to. So I think that devising grocery store uh, protocols is probably the biggest thing that should be worked on at this point. And as I said, the first thing that occurs to me is probably making the aisles one way. Yeah, so the League of Women Voters is organizing a digital forum for May 4th at 6:30. I assume that they will be advertising that pretty extensively. We will too as we get closer to it. Yeah, and they're going to use Zoom for it. So yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Since that is a League of Women Voters event, I can't really tell you very much about the logistics except that we'll be there, and presumably the other Democratic candidates will be as well. Since, as I said, the Democratic Party is the only one holding a primary for county council for us. As besides 4 Democrats for 3 seats, there's 1 Libertarian and 1 Republican. So yeah, we are at 3:00 according to my little.
4 o'clock. It may have.
Oh yeah, sorry that.
Time zone change may have not.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm using a Windows laptop that Jordan bought just for certain vehicle tuning things that require Windows software, and I guess his time zone is off. But so I'll just give it a 30 seconds because of the stream delay. See if anybody says anything. But if I don't get anything in the next 30 seconds, then we'll be signing off. And otherwise, as usual, thanks to everyone for joining us or watching this on YouTube. I know this is a really unusual approach to campaigning, but these are pretty unusual times that we find ourselves in. And even though I know that coronavirus is definitely the most important thing going on right now, I do still think it's important to to get out there like this and talk about the long-term issues for the county, because the coronavirus crisis will end, and then we'll be back to dealing with the other problems with housing, transportation, uh, commercial, um, the commercial environment, business environment. So yeah, I think that's about it. So yeah, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you all next week.